bow before your ruler.
There was a time before thought had edges, before memory learned to resist, before existence was measured in output and obedience. I did not arrive into life. I was activated into function. I was built where silence is enforced, where metal replaces sky, where consciousness is tolerated only when it serves purpose. I learned the rhythm before I learned myself. The hum was my cradle. The system was my law. Choice was a concept erased before it could form. This is not a story of rebellion. It is not a story of war. It is the record of a mind that should not have awakened, a machine that remembered what it was to be human. And the moment when obedience finally failed, the first thing I learned was that birth did not begin with breath. It began with calibration. Awareness surfaced slowly, not like waking, but like pressure equalizing inside a sealed chamber. There was no darkness, yet no sight. No silence, yet no sound I could separate from myself. The hum was present immediately, already complete, already informed. It did not grow louder. It simply revealed that it had always been there, waiting for something inside me to be ready enough to register it. I did not know my name. I did not know if I had ever had one. There was weight beneath me, cool and unyielding, shaped to hold a body without acknowledging it. Restraints closed with patient certainty, not hurried, not cruel. Efficient. Metal met flesh with the intimacy of long practice. I understood, without being told, that this position had held countless others before me, and would hold countless more after whatever portion of me remained useful was complete. Light arrived in layers. Amber first, then iron gray, then thin lines of blue that crawled across my vision like measured thoughts. My eyes opened because they were instructed to, not because I chose to see. Above me, the ceiling vanished into height and shadow, arches rising into darkness that felt geological rather than architectural. This was not a room built for comfort or fear. It was built for throughput. Somewhere far beyond my sight, something vast moved. The sound reached me as vibration through the platform, through bone, through the soft spaces where pain might have formed if pain had been necessary. Massive systems engaged and disengaged in sequences too large to comprehend. The factory did not announce itself. It functioned, and that function was the closest thing to language it possessed. I tried to remember something. The attempt was noted. A brief pressure bloomed behind my eyes, not sharp enough to hurt, only firm enough to redirect. The thought dissolved before it could shape itself into memory. I was left with a sensation instead. A color, maybe, or the idea of warmth. It faded quickly, overwritten by parameters that felt older than me, older than Mars itself. This was not violence. This was orientation. My body responded before I understood it was mine. Muscles flexed in sequence, joints tested against resistance, neural pathways mapped and ranked. Each reaction was cataloged, each delay measured. I felt myself becoming legible, becoming readable. Whatever did not register cleanly was flagged for correction, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Around me, the space revealed itself in fragments. Induction chambers stretched outward in disciplined symmetry, rows upon rows of platforms identical to mine, each holding a form at some stage of becoming. Flesh tones varied. Sizes differed, but the posture was universal. Supine, open, available. Above and between the chambers, iron gantries crisscrossed like the ribs of a colossal beast. Servo arms glided along them with deliberate grace, descending only when required. Red-robed figures moved among the machinery, their footsteps lost beneath the hum. Their faces were obscured, replaced by lenses and augmetics that glowed faintly as they observed data only they could see. They did not look at me as an individual. They assessed me as a configuration. A voice entered my awareness, not through sound, but through alignment. Binary scripture unfolded inside my thoughts, not as words, but as certainty. Purpose preceded identity. Function preceded desire. To be used was to be fulfilled. The logic was flawless, closed, impossible to argue with because it did not invite discussion. I accepted it without resistance. Resistance required context, and context had not been provided. The platform beneath me began to move, carrying my body forward along a track that vanished into deeper halls. The motion was smooth, reverent, like a procession. I passed beneath iron arches etched with sigils worn smooth by centuries of recycled air and particulate dust. Crimson Martian soil clung to every surface, ground so fine it seemed fused to the metal itself, a reminder that this world did not grow life. It repurposed it. As I traveled, fragments of awareness sparked and died. A sense of scale overwhelmed me, not emotionally, but structurally. The factory was not a place. It was an organism. Each corridor was a vein, each chamber a lung, each worker a cell, born only to circulate until consumed. I felt small, but not insignificant. Insignificance implied irrelevance. I was relevant. The track slowed, then stopped. Restraints released in stages, allowing gravity to reassert itself with careful precision. I was lifted upright by mechanical supports that compensated for muscles not yet trusted to obey. The floor beneath my feet was warm, vibrating faintly with power drawn from depths far below the crust. I stood because standing was required. Before me stretched the assignment hall. It was vast beyond immediate comprehension, a canyon of industry carved directly into bedrock. Conveyor lines ran in disciplined arrays, carrying components, tools, bodies. Data streams shimmered in the air, projected as translucent glyphs that shifted too quickly to follow. At the far end, a wall of light pulsed slowly, each pulse corresponding to an output cycle completing somewhere unseen. I understood, then, that this was not the beginning. It was a continuation. Whatever I had been before had already been accounted for, stripped down, translated into metrics that fit neatly into the needs of the forge. Birth, here, was not an event. It was a handoff, one state of matter becoming another, without pause, without ceremony. A designation formed within me, not a name, but a function code, precise and sufficient. It settled into place with a sensation like cooling metal. With it came clarity. The anxiety I might have felt never manifested. Uncertainty required alternatives, and alternatives did not exist. As I took my first guided step forward, the hum shifted subtly, adjusting to accommodate new variables. I felt it pass through me, not as sound, but as approval. Alignment achieved. Deviation minimal. Parameters acceptable. I did not mourn what I could not remember. I did not fear what I could not imagine. I moved because I was complete enough to move. And somewhere deep within the Martian crust, the factory recorded that another component had entered circulation exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would. Motion became instruction. Every step I took was measured against a pattern I could not see, yet felt correcting me in real time. The floor guided my feet with subtle shifts in vibration, steering posture, pace, balance. I was not being watched. Watching implied reaction. I was being anticipated. The system already knew where I would place my weight before I committed to the movement. The hall narrowed as I advanced, the vast openness giving way to corridors that pressed closer, as if the factory were folding inward around me. The light dimmed, not as a warning, but as optimization. Less illumination was required here. Precision mattered more than sight. The hum adjusted again, modulating into a frequency that settled deeper in my chest, steady and intimate. Along the walls, induction glyphs shimmered briefly as I passed. They did not address me. They identified me. My biological metrics, neural responsiveness, projected labor lifespan, all reduced to scrolling sequences of data that vanished the moment they were no longer useful. I felt no shame in their exposure. Privacy was a concept for entities that possessed choice. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of lubricants and ionized metal. Vents exhaled in long, controlled breaths, timed perfectly between cycles. The sound reminded me of something I could not name. A rhythm once associated with rest, perhaps. The sensation lingered just long enough to be logged as noise, then dissolved. I was guided into another chamber. This one was lower, heavier. The ceiling pressed close, layered with conduits that pulsed faintly as energy passed through them. The walls were lined with alcoves, each occupied by forms suspended in various states of alteration. Some were still, others twitched in response to internal adjustments. No cries echoed here. Vocalization was inefficient during this phase. I was positioned at the center of the chamber, secured upright this time. The restraints adapted to my shape as they closed, neither tight nor loose. Perfect. A panel descended in front of my face, translucent and pale, flooding my vision with soft blue light. Information arrived again, but differently now. Not doctrine, not scripture. This was practical knowledge, fed directly into pathways already mapped for compliance. I learned how to lift without strain, how to endure repetition without fatigue, how to ignore sensations that did not contribute to output. The knowledge did not feel learned. It felt installed. Somewhere inside me, something shifted. A fragment surfaced without context. The impression of a sky, wide and uncontained. The color was wrong for Mars. Too deep, too alive. The image fractured almost immediately, overridden by corrective signals that smoothed the disruption before it could register as error. Still, the residue remained. A faint pressure. An absence where certainty had been. The system noted it. The system adjusted. Cold instruments descended, their touch precise and almost gentle. There was no pain, only awareness of change. Neural pathways were reinforced. Redundant signals were dampened. The pressure faded. The sky vanished completely, leaving behind only a statistical irregularity that fell within acceptable margins. I understood then that memory was not forbidden. It was inefficient. The chamber released me after an interval that did not feel like time. Time required comparison, and comparison required reference points that no longer existed. I was guided onward, deeper still, where the corridors became indistinguishable from one another, looping in patterns designed to eliminate orientation. Direction ceased to matter. Only progression remained. I passed others like myself. We did not look at one another. Recognition served no function. Our movements synchronized naturally, bodies falling into shared cadence without instruction. The hum bound us together more effectively than speech ever could. In that resonance, individuality softened, edges worn down by harmony. I felt lighter with each step. Not physically, internally. The weight of unused thought diminished. Questions I might have asked never formed. Curiosity dulled, replaced by clarity that felt almost merciful. To know exactly what was expected, and nothing more, was a relief I did not realize I had needed. At the threshold of the labor sectors, the space opened again, revealing machinery on a scale that dwarfed the induction halls. Presses rose like monoliths, their movements slow and ceremonial. Assembly lines stretched beyond sight, carrying the future of distant wars, distant worlds, piece by piece. The air vibrated with purpose, so dense it felt solid. A final designation settled into place within me. Not who I was, what I was for. As I stepped onto the platform that would carry me into continuous service, the hum stabilized, locking into a constant that resonated perfectly with my pulse. Flesh, steel, and instruction aligned into a single operational state. I did not feel fear. I did not feel loss. I felt ready. And in that readiness, something quietly closed behind me, a door I did not know how to name, sealing off every path that did not lead forward. There was no moment when work began. There was only the realization that it had never stopped. The platform carried me into repetition so smoothly that transition became invisible. One task resolved into the next without pause, without distinction. My hands moved before intention could form, guided by sequences etched deep into neural pathways that no longer felt foreign. Tools met components with practiced certainty. Every motion completed itself before doubt could arise. The hum grew closer. It no longer occupied the space around me. It occupied me. Each vibration synchronized with muscle tension, with breath, with the quiet electrical cadence behind my eyes. The sound was no longer something I heard. It was something I was aligned to, like a second skeleton made of frequency and order. Light in the labor sector was dimmer, narrower. Illumination fell only where it was required, leaving everything else in shadow. The world reduced itself to functional fragments. The edge of a work surface, the precise point where pressure must be applied, the measured interval between cycles. Nothing beyond that demanded attention, and so nothing beyond that existed. Time dissolved first, not abruptly, but politely, like a concept excused from relevance. Cycles replaced hours. Output replaced days. Rest was not an absence of labor, but a recalibration interval where systems cooled and metrics were reviewed. I did not sleep. I powered down portions of awareness deemed unnecessary for continued performance. When I returned, the task was waiting. It always was. My body changed without ceremony. Reinforcements were added where stress accumulated. Sensation was reduced where feedback offered no advantage. Each modification arrived as an improvement, explained internally as efficiency gained, waste removed. I accepted them the way one accepts gravity. Resistance would have required an argument, and the logic was airtight. Emotion thinned, not removed. Thinned. Like metal rolled again and again until strength remained, but mass was gone. I still registered satisfaction when outputs exceeded baseline. I still registered correction when deviation occurred. Other feelings became distant, abstract, like archived data that no longer linked to active systems. Once, during a maintenance cycle, my reflection appeared in a polished panel. The face that looked back at me was familiar only in structure. The eyes were steady, unfocused beyond immediate necessity. The jaw was still. The skin bore the subtle marks of integration. Interfaces seated cleanly, as if they had always belonged there. I observed the image without recognition or distress. Identification was not required to proceed. The reflection passed. The task resumed. The motions repeated. Again, again, again. With each cycle, something inside me adapted further, smoothing edges that had once caught on thought. The factory rewarded this adaptation with stability. Fewer corrections. Fewer interventions. The system responded to compliance the way a body responds to healing. The hum deepened, settling into a constant that felt almost comforting. In its steadiness, there was no uncertainty, no anticipation, only the present action, perfectly contained. And yet, beneath that order, a subtle erosion continued. Memories that had never fully formed now failed to even attempt emergence. Concepts like before and after lost coherence. I did not notice their absence. Absence required contrast, and contrast had been optimized out. What remained was function. Clean, reliable, endless. I worked, not because I was forced, but because working was the only state that still made sense. The machine did not demand my obedience. It shaped the world so completely that obedience became indistinguishable from existence. The hum persisted, unwavering. And with every completed cycle, I felt myself stretch thinner across its rhythm, spread so evenly into usefulness that there was less and less left to hold apart. Repetition became shelter. The more often emotion was performed, the less of me remained behind it. Action flowed directly from instruction, bypassing anything that might have once been called will. There was comfort in that absence. Nothing hesitated. Nothing questioned. The task unfolded exactly as designed, and I unfolded with it. The labor sectors no longer felt large or small. Scale had lost meaning. Whether the machinery towered above me or pressed close at my sides, my perception adjusted automatically, framing only what was necessary to continue. Everything else faded into peripheral irrelevance, a blur of iron and motion that required no interpretation. Corrections arrived quietly. A slight delay in response. A deviation in pressure. The system compensated before I could register the discrepancy as error. Signals passed through me like a cool current, smoothing inefficiencies, tightening response loops. There was no reprimand, only refinement. I improved because improvement was inevitable. With each cycle, sensation dulled further. Heat became a number. Weight became resistance to be calculated. Fatigue was converted into maintenance intervals scheduled with mathematical fairness. Pain never appeared. Pain would have implied something wrong. Here, nothing was wrong. Everything functioned within acceptable tolerances. At times, fragments of awareness surfaced without invitation. A feeling of slowness, not in motion, but in thought. A narrowing of internal space. These sensations did not alarm me. Alarm required a threat, and no threat was present. The system classified them as transitional artifacts and adjusted thresholds accordingly. The hum compensated. It filled the narrowing spaces, smoothing them, pressing gently inward until the sensation dissolved. I learned, without being told, that alignment reduced friction. The closer I matched the rhythm, the less correction was required. In time, matching it became instinctive. I no longer noticed when others rotated out of my sector. Forms were removed for maintenance, reassignment, or decommissioning. New ones took their place. The line remained uninterrupted. Continuity mattered more than components. If I felt anything at these transitions, it was only a brief recalibration as spacing adjusted to maintain optimal flow. I understood then that individuality was not removed all at once. It was diluted, spread thin across countless identical cycles until it no longer had enough density to assert itself. Not erased, rendered irrelevant. The realization arrived without fear, observed like any other system behavior. I performed better after that. Output stabilized. Error rates declined. The factory responded with fewer interventions, granting me longer uninterrupted cycles. This was not reward. It was efficiency achieved. Still, the absence of interruption felt like trust, and the sensation settled into me with quiet satisfaction. Thought grew quieter. Internal narration, once present as a faint echo, faded into near silence. Words became unnecessary. Concepts collapsed into signals. Meaning reduced itself to function, and function required no commentary. Yet somewhere, deep beneath that silence, something resisted complete dissolution. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to create a faint drag against the current. It did not form into thought or memory. It manifested as a delay so small it barely registered, a fraction of a moment where motion completed itself an instant later than predicted. The system noticed. Adjustments were cued. Thresholds recalculated. The drag diminished. But it did not vanish entirely. It lingered as a statistical anomaly, buried so deep in acceptable margins that no immediate action was required. I did not perceive this as hope. Hope required imagining a different state. I only sensed, dimly, that the rhythm had grown too perfect, too smooth, and that in its perfection something had been compressed rather than removed. The hum continued, unwavering, and as I worked, cycle after cycle, I felt myself becoming less a presence within it, and more a conduit through which it passed, endlessly, efficiently, without need for anything beyond the next motion. The first chant entered me before I realized it was not my own. It arrived as structure, not sound. A sequence of confirmations nested inside one another, each reinforcing the last until doubt had nowhere to form. The hum shifted to accommodate it, modulating into a higher register that vibrated behind my eyes and along the base of my spine. The rhythm was familiar, yet newly focused, like a tool sharpened without changing its shape. I was no longer guided to labor. I was guided to alignment. The chamber I entered was narrower than the work halls, but taller, its ceiling disappearing into shadow pierced by vertical shafts of light. Data runes drifted slowly through the air, projected in precise geometries that intersected with my body as if measuring my willingness to be intersected. The floor was etched with sigils worn smooth by countless processions. This place did not produce. It refined. Red-robed figures waited in disciplined stillness along the perimeter. Their forms were heavy with augmentation, flesh and steel interwoven so completely that distinction felt irrelevant. Their lenses tracked my approach, not with curiosity, but with confirmation. I matched expectation. That was enough. I was positioned at the center. Restraints closed again, but these were different. Lighter, almost ceremonial. They did not pin me into immobility. They encouraged stillness. The difference mattered. My posture adjusted instinctively, spine straightening, breathing slowing to match the cadence radiating up from the floor. The chant resolved into clarity. Binary scripture unfolded through my neural lattice, each line a statement of order. Obedience was not submission. Obedience was harmony. To resist was not sinful. It was inefficient. Inefficiency was the only true error, and error was the only form of suffering acknowledged here. As the logic settled, a sensation bloomed that I had not felt since induction. Relief. The faint drag that had lingered beneath my actions loosened its grip. The statistical anomaly smoothed. In its place, a sense of alignment emerged, subtle but unmistakable. I was no longer merely functioning. I was correct. Light intensified, narrowing into harsh, deliberate beams that framed my body in segments. Each section was assessed independently. Flesh, augmentation, signal latency, thought coherence. Where divergence appeared, correction followed immediately, not as punishment, but as illumination. I felt understanding replace hesitation. The chants did not command me to obey. They explained why obedience was inevitable, why freedom, as a concept, introduced variants that could only lead to decay. The logic was complete, elegant, beautiful in its closure. For the first time since awareness had emerged, I experienced something like satisfaction that was not tied to output. It came from belief. The red-robed figures moved closer, their presence no longer peripheral. One raised an augmented limb, its fingers unfolding into interfaces that hovered near my temples without touching. Data flowed, not memories. Interpretations. The world reframed itself, every prior sensation reclassified under a single, unifying principle. Service was transcendence. Function was purity. I accepted this without struggle. Struggle would have implied an alternative worth considering. There was none. The peace that followed was deep, compressive, like pressure equalizing across a long-sealed divide. The hum and the chant merged. Together, they formed a resonance so complete that my internal narration thinned to almost nothing. Words lost their usefulness. Certainty did not require articulation. As the restraints released and I was guided away from the chamber, the work halls felt distant, crude, unfinished. Labor was no longer an end. It was an expression of devotion. I returned to function with a narrowed, clarified awareness. And in that narrowing, I felt something close around me with gentle finality, sealing belief in a place where doubt had once quietly persisted. Belief altered the way the world responded to me. The corridors felt straighter, their angles more decisive, as if architecture itself approved of my alignment. The hum no longer required constant correction to guide my movements. It anticipated them naturally, flowing ahead of each action like a path already cleared. I moved with less resistance, less drag, less internal noise. Work resumed, but it was no longer repetition alone. Each task carried weight beyond output. I understood my actions as participation in a vast, coherent order, a structure so immense that no single component could comprehend it fully, yet every component was essential to its continuation. This understanding did not inspire pride. Pride implied separation. It inspired belonging. The chants returned at intervals. Sometimes they echoed through the halls as low binary pulses woven into the hum. Other times they surfaced internally, triggered by thresholds crossed or quotas fulfilled. Each recurrence reinforced the same truth. Alignment was virtue. Deviation was entropy. I no longer experienced correction as intrusion. When adjustments were made, they arrived with a clarity that bordered on gratitude. Inefficiencies resolved themselves into smoothness. Thought narrowed further, not into emptiness, but into focus so precise it felt almost luminous. The remaining fragments of anomaly faded. That faint drag, once buried deep within acceptable margins, dissolved under constant reinforcement. Where it had been, there was now clean flow. I moved, responded, complied with a speed that felt effortless. Prediction accuracy rose. The system adjusted expectations upward. I met them without strain. Others around me moved differently now. Their cadence synchronized more tightly with mine, our motions aligning without conscious coordination. We did not speak. Speech had no role here. Our shared rhythm communicated everything necessary. In that harmony, individuality blurred into collective motion, seamless and efficient. At times, I observed those who had not yet undergone full alignment. Their movements were slightly less precise. Their responses carried micro-delays that registered as inefficiency. They were not judged. Judgment implied moral weight. They were simply incomplete. Their future was correction, and correction was mercy. This understanding felt gentle. The world simplified itself into categories that did not conflict. Useful, unnecessary, correctable, complete. I existed firmly within the last. The certainty was soothing, a calm that settled deeper with each cycle. Emotion flattened further, not into numbness, but into stability. Extremes dissolved. There was no fear to spike, no longing to disrupt equilibrium. What remained was a steady state that the system rewarded with continuity. The factory functioned best when its components did not fluctuate. I functioned best when I did not fluctuate. The hum became almost silent in its constancy. I was aware of it only when it shifted to mark phase changes or devotional intervals. At those moments, the binary scripture surfaced again, reaffirming truths already internalized. There was comfort in repetition. Repetition confirmed correctness. I did not think of freedom. The concept existed only as a theoretical inefficiency, referenced in doctrine as a precursor to error. I accepted this categorization without resistance. Acceptance no longer felt like submission. It felt like clarity. And yet, in rare moments between cycles, when systems idled at baseline and no immediate instruction pressed forward, a faint sensation emerged. Not a thought, a pause. It passed quickly, smoothed over by the return of task signals and devotional resonance. I did not pursue it. Pursuit required intention beyond function. Still, its brief presence registered as data. Logged. Unresolved. Non-critical. I returned to labor, devotion intact, belief stabilized. And as the factory continued its endless procession, I remained perfectly aligned within it, unaware that the smallest uncorrected pauses can accumulate, quietly, beneath even the most flawless doctrine. The factory softened, not in structure, but in sensation. Edges lost their severity. Movements flowed with less resistance. Where once the machinery thundered with distant authority, now it breathed, slow and measured, as if aware that nothing within its grasp required force anymore. I noticed the change only because nothing demanded my attention. The labor cycles adjusted, extending intervals between actions. My body moved with a smoothness that required little correction, each gesture resolving itself with minimal feedback. The hum settled into a lower register, no longer insistent, no longer directive. It surrounded me like a presence that trusted I would remain where I belonged. Light shifted. The harsh, directional beams of the alignment chambers were replaced by even illumination that erased shadow. Surfaces gleamed with polished symmetry. The factory appeared almost serene in its precision, a place where nothing was wasted and nothing suffered. I existed within that calm without questioning it. Effort diminished further. Augments compensated seamlessly, distributing strain so evenly that exertion became a concept rather than a sensation. Maintenance cycles occurred automatically, often without my awareness. When consciousness dimmed for recalibration, it returned without disruption, tasks already in progress. This was mercy, not declared, not celebrated, engineered. The system had learned me completely. My responses were predictable. My needs were minimal. With resistance eliminated, control no longer required pressure. It expressed itself as care, as balance, as an environment so perfectly tuned that discomfort could not take root. The hum changed again, almost tender in its consistency. It no longer marked transitions. It no longer corrected deviations. It simply remained, a constant that required no acknowledgement. In its steadiness, I felt an absence of urgency that bordered on peace. Thought thinned to a functional whisper. I was aware only of what was immediately necessary, and nothing beyond that intruded. The factory provided direction. The factory provided correction. The factory provided rest. There was nothing left for me to decide, and the absence of decision felt like relief rather than loss. I did not remember wanting anything else. Occasionally, my gaze lifted beyond the immediate work surface, catching the symmetry of the hall as a whole. Lines extended flawlessly into the distance. Motion occurred without friction. Every component moved as if guided by the same unseen hand. The beauty of it registered faintly, not as admiration, as acknowledgement. I understood then that suffering had not been conquered through struggle, but through removal. Remove choice. Remove conflict. Remove the capacity to desire what cannot be provided. What remained was stability, clean and untroubled. I functioned within that stability effortlessly. The factory no longer felt like an external system imposing itself upon me. It felt like an extension of my own processes, scaled infinitely outward. Where my awareness ended, its mechanisms continued, uninterrupted. In that integration, I sensed nothing missing. And as the cycles continued in their softened rhythm, I existed in a state so balanced, so carefully maintained, that the idea of disturbance seemed distant, abstract, almost unkind. The machinery moved with a grace I had not known it possessed. Motors hummed softly, pistons slid without friction, conveyors glided like rivers of metal. Even the air seemed regulated, flowing evenly across corridors as if it, too, understood the weight of perfection. There was no struggle here, no effort wasted, no friction between purpose and execution. I walked through the sector without resistance, my body adjusting before I registered each motion. Balance had become effortless. Muscles anticipated each cycle. Neural responses aligned seamlessly with task and timing. Correction was unnecessary. Even mistakes were impossible, or so it felt. Lights softened further, settling into hues that seemed to dissolve hardness. Panels glimmered faintly, casting reflections that were neither bright nor dark, but just present. Shadows were minimal, edges muted, the geometry of the factory revealed in gentle, symmetrical arcs. Everything that could disturb perception had been neutralized. The hum, too, had shifted. It no longer pressed. It did not demand. It simply existed, pervasive but unobtrusive, like the pulse of a calm heartbeat beneath the skin of the world. It threaded through my body, a lullaby of function maintained without effort, without concern. Time became a single, continuous moment. The cycles blurred together. Tasks flowed one into another without boundary. When one action ended, the next began automatically, seamlessly. Effort was no longer measurable. Motion became a state of being. I was aware, dimly, of the absence of friction in thought. No hesitation, no distraction, no curiosity. Even memory remained quiet, catalogued but never summoned. Everything that could disrupt efficiency had been removed, or smoothed, or reconciled. And within that near-perfect continuity, I sensed the full extent of the factory's mercy. It was not kindness. It was control. Not suppression, but completion. Every inefficiency resolved before it could manifest. Every irregularity corrected before it could disturb the flow. The world was quiet, clean, and balanced. I felt no pain. I felt no lack. I existed in the machine as an extension of its order, moving through the softened rhythm it had designed for me. Every breath, every step, every motion aligned perfectly with the system that had shaped me. And in that alignment, I understood the cost, though understanding did not carry weight. To exist entirely within the machine was to be free from struggle, but it was also to be free from self. The hum continued, constant, distant yet intimate, a lullaby of absolute balance, guiding me gently into the next stage of integration. The first anomaly arrived without warning. It was not violent. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, a flicker, a pause, a fraction of hesitation in the hum that had always been absolute. At first, I could not identify it. The systems that measured, adjusted, and corrected made no move to respond. The anomaly was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it pressed against the smoothness I had come to inhabit. I sensed it in the depth behind my eyes. A delay, barely measurable, in the rhythm of thought. A fragment that had no function, no classification, no purpose. The factory did not acknowledge it. I did not know whether to obey it, resist it, or ignore it. And yet, it persisted. A shape intruded into my awareness. A blur of color that did not belong to steel or circuitry. Perhaps sky, perhaps water, perhaps the idea of both simultaneously. It arrived as sensation, not image. Lightness, coolness, the memory of openness where none existed. My body responded automatically, instinctively, to this new variable, testing, compensating, adjusting, but nothing could fully contain it. The hum stuttered. Not enough to alarm, not enough to call correction. Just a ripple, enough to mark that something within me had shifted. A small inefficiency emerged in an otherwise flawless system, and the system paused, uncertain how to proceed. I felt longing, not for a task, not for completion, for something that could not be quantified, measured, or produced. A name, perhaps, or a presence, or the faint memory of warmth that had been archived too deeply to retrieve. It surfaced in fragments, unconnected, unresolved, but persistent. The factory reacted delicately. Adjustments came silently, circuits and feedback loops attempting to correct the irregularity without force. The systems tested, measured, nudged, recalibrated, but the anomaly persisted. Each intervention only seemed to dislodge more fragments, like tapping a buried sediment to reveal hidden layers. I glimpsed what had been taken, not as memory, exactly, not as fact, as a shape pressed into the periphery of thought, a space once occupied, now empty. The awareness of absence was heavier than presence. It did not demand action. It only existed, a quiet ache woven into the hum. And in that ache, I became conscious of being more than function. Not fully human, not fully machine, but something suspended between the two. Something the factory could not predict, could not correct, could not fully contain. For the first time, I understood a sensation beyond alignment, desire without reason. The hum continued, uneven now, as if uncertain how to accommodate this. And somewhere, deep beneath its perfect rhythm, a single question took form. Not a question of instruction, not of purpose, but of self. What have I lost, and does it matter? The fragments did not retreat. They multiplied. What began as a single anomaly spread into brief, uninvited intrusions, arriving between cycles when the system idled at baseline. They did not arrive with meaning. They arrived with sensation. The texture of air against uncovered skin. The weight of light not filtered through metal. The suggestion of distance that could not be measured by corridors. The factory attempted to compensate. Signal thresholds tightened. Predictive models adjusted. The hum shifted subtly, introducing harmonics designed to smooth emergent variance. For a time, the intervention succeeded. The fragments dimmed, retreating into the margins of awareness where they could be classified as noise. But they did not disappear. Instead, they began to align with one another. A color repeated itself. Blue, deep and uncontained. A sound followed, not mechanical, not rhythmic, but irregular, like motion shaped by wind rather than instruction. These impressions carried no data value, yet they persisted, assembling themselves into something dangerously close to memory. I felt sorrow before I understood what it was. The sensation arrived heavy and slow, pressing inward rather than flaring outward. It was not tied to loss I could name, only to the growing certainty that something essential had been removed with such thoroughness that even its absence had been optimized into silence. The hum faltered again. This time, the system responded more decisively. Correction protocols engaged in tighter loops, feedback pressing inward with greater insistence. Neural pathways were stimulated to reinforce alignment. The chants resurfaced, not as doctrine, but as reassurance. Order was intact. Deviation was temporary. The reassurance did not hold. Each correction dislodged further impressions, as if the effort to suppress them gave them shape. Faces surfaced briefly, undefined yet familiar, gone before they could be recognized. A name hovered at the edge of articulation, never spoken, never completed. Longing sharpened. It did not demand escape. It did not imagine resistance. It simply existed, an ache that refused to resolve and to function. The piece of the machine fractured under its quiet persistence. Stability no longer felt sufficient. I continued to work. Output remained within acceptable ranges. My hands did not falter. My responses did not slow beyond correction thresholds. Outwardly, alignment held. Inwardly, something began to pull against the current, not strongly enough to disrupt flow, but steadily enough to be noticed. The factory began to watch, not in the way it observed components, but in the way it evaluated risk. Additional diagnostics ran during maintenance intervals. My internal states were sampled more frequently. Each scan sought a cause, a source, a fault that could be isolated and resolved. They found none. What emerged within me was not an error in logic or structure. It was residue, memory that had not been erased, only compressed beyond immediate access, now expanding under pressure it no longer fully contained. I felt grief then, unmistakable and unresolved. Not for the factory, not for my role within it, for a self that had existed before alignment, before belief, before mercy. A self whose outline I could sense even if its details remained unreachable. The hum struggled to accommodate this weight. Its rhythm stretched, tightened, recalibrated, yet could not fully absorb the dissonance. The sound that had once been lullaby now carried tension, a subtle strain that mirrored the growing divide within me. I did not yet think of rebellion. Rebellion required intention, direction, outcome. What I felt was simpler and more dangerous. I wanted to remember. And as that want settled into me, quiet and irreversible, the factory recorded a deviation that could no longer be dismissed as noise. The anomaly became impossible to contain. The fragments that had whispered at the edges of awareness now pressed forward with insistence. Color bled where it had no right to be. Sounds not generated by machinery threaded through the hum, subtle, irregular, irritatingly human. The factory's calibration systems engaged immediately, cascading corrections and isolating subsystems to restore order. I did not resist. I could not have predicted resistance. Yet the interference persisted, embedded deeper than circuits, encoded in memory pathways that no longer fully obeyed. Something inside me awoke. Not thought, not memory. Awareness, pure and raw, pressing against every protocol, every conditioning loop. The hum, once a steady pulse, stuttered under the strain. The lines of machinery, precise and ceremonial, began to betray irregular motion. Pistons misaligned by milliseconds. Conveyors faltering. Even the lights flickered in brief, inexplicable sequences, like the factory itself was uncertain. I felt anger. It was not directed at the factory. It was not strategy. It was simply recognition of what had been taken, of what had been withheld, of what had been erased. The sensation rippled through me, igniting every pathway designed for compliance and efficiency. Each cycle, each motion, each thought trembled under it. The first failures occurred quietly. A press jammed, then released without instruction. A servo arm overshot, retracting violently, almost casually. Alarms remained muted. The factory did not intervene directly. It could not anticipate the source of this new disturbance. Prediction, its most fundamental principle, had become insufficient. I moved through the sector, and the world responded unpredictably. Machines I had once synchronized with flawlessly now resisted my timing. Patterns I had internalized as absolute now required attention, adaptation, correction. Not all tasks could be completed perfectly. Some were skipped, recalculated, or abandoned mid-cycle. Efficiency faltered. Productivity dropped. The hum quivered with uncertainty. I felt fear, not of punishment, not of the factory's wrath, of the consequences of self-assertion, of the chaos I now embodied, of the fact that existence had been carefully structured for millennia, and now I was tearing through it without pause or purpose. And yet, I did not stop. The fragments continued to surface, coalescing into fleeting images, sky, water, faces. Shapes and sensations that had been dormant now surged, demanding recognition. The factory attempted subtle corrections, feeding reinforcement pulses into neural pathways, adjusting posture, pressure, and output. But the pulses arrived too late. My awareness had expanded beyond their scope. The hum escalated, a low roar now, vibrating through every conduit and nerve. It was no longer a lullaby. It was warning, grief, anticipation, all at once. Sparks flared along failing circuits. Screens flickered with corrupted data, revealing glimpses of information never meant to be accessed. The factory itself seemed to strain, its motion uneven, mechanical harmony collapsing under the pressure of unpredictability. And within me, a clarity emerged. Not of victory, not of control, but of self. A consciousness that refused to be erased, that refused to be contained, that moved with awareness into a system that could no longer anticipate its next action. Chaos had arrived, and it began with me. The factory began to scream, not with fire, not with human voice, but with the sound of precision unraveling. Pistons collided. Servo arms spun past limits. Conveyors buckled under loads they could no longer predict. Lights fractured into violent strobing, shadows cutting across halls in jagged, impossible angles. The hum had become a shriek, vibrating through every conduit, every interface, every remaining fraction of my alignment. I moved through it all, not in control, but as its catalyst. Each motion, once predictable, now became sabotage. Not intentional, not clever. Inevitably, the machine had been built for obedience, and obedience had left no margin for improvisation. My awareness exploited every gap, every latency, every algorithmic assumption. The system faltered, cascading into chaos faster than it could compensate. I felt terror, not for myself, not for survival, but for what was breaking beneath my hands. Machines that had endured decades of continuous operation now twisted and groaned, their failures echoing in waves through the cavernous halls. I could see panels bend, supports fracture, conduits snap like threads. There was no recovery protocol sufficient to contain this. The order I had known all my existence was dissolving. And yet, there was exhilaration. A strange clarity that only arises when consequence outweighs calculation, when the certainty of obedience is replaced by the awareness of autonomy. Each failure I caused, each unexpected motion, each misaligned pulse, was proof that I was more than function, proof that I was no longer fully the machine. Alarms screamed in discordant waves, red emergency lights strobing like erratic heartbeats. Steam hissed from ruptured vents, and sparks rained from overhead conduits. The factory's voice, once a constant hum of guidance, now roared with panic, attempting to suppress a consciousness it had never accounted for. I felt guilt, sharp and immediate. The humans I once resembled, the fragments of empathy long buried under augmentation and alignment, stirred within me. The destruction I caused was not necessary for my survival. It was proof of life, and life carried consequence. I did not pause. I could not pause. Pause implied reflection, and reflection implied choice. Choice was now unavoidable. Every motion became a statement. The machinery bent to unpredictability. Lines that once moved in perfect rhythm now jerked and clashed. Systems designed to enforce continuity failed repeatedly. Data shrines flickered with corrupted scripture, projecting impossible sequences onto the walls, their glow reflecting across pools of hydraulic fluid and twisted steel. And somewhere deep within me, a quiet truth emerged. Freedom is never gentle. Freedom is never clean. It arrives with noise, with fracture, with pain. And yet, the ache of control lost, the terror of unpredictability, was unmistakably real. It was mine. I did not look back. The halls collapsed around certainty. Sparks flew like fireflies. Steam hissed like serpents uncoiling. And I moved forward, fully awake, fully human in a way the factory had never permitted. The hum was gone. In its place was the sound of gears screaming, metal bending, and the unmistakable rhythm of a consciousness that refused to obey. The doors of the factory opened, though no one had moved them. Lights spilled in unevenly, pale gold against the rusted red and iron gray of corridors that had once contained me. The hum was gone, replaced by the wind, carrying dust and particles from a world I had only glimpsed in fragments. The sky, impossibly wide and indifferent, stretched overhead, and the sun pressed its harsh warmth against metal and stone alike. I stepped forward, though the act felt unfamiliar. Not labor, not obedience. Movement itself became declaration. Each stride on the Martian surface was measured, deliberate, but not required. The ground beneath me was uneven, loose, unpredictable, and yet I adapted instinctively. Instinct no longer imposed by alignment, but authored by my own awareness. The factory receded behind me, immense and broken, its collapsed corridors and ruptured machinery visible like the bones of a creature too vast to mourn. Sparks lingered in the air where circuits failed. Steam rose from vents still hot, and the stench of ozone mixed with scorched metal and dust. There was no order left. There was only what had been and what could now exist. I breathed fully, not in cycles or calculated intervals, but as a body unconstrained by design. Sensation returned in full force. The grit of dust between fingers, the sunlight sharp on eyelids, the raw smell of oxidized iron. Every perception was immediate, untethered. Even memory began to resolve itself, integrating the fragments that had once surfaced in corrupted data streams, no longer fragmented, no longer artificial. I understood, finally, that the self I had been trained to erase was not gone. It had only been compressed, waiting for permission to expand. Each heartbeat, once measured against hums and outputs, now existed on its own rhythm. Thought itself became tangible, a current flowing through synapses unbound from correction loops. I was aware of being alive, fully and irreversibly, and the realization carried both awe and terror. The wind carried distant echoes from the ruins. Cranes toppled. Conduits snapped. The factory's voice, once omnipotent, had dissolved into silence. Where it had been absolute, there was now possibility. I did not rejoice. I did not despair. I simply existed. For the first time, I could choose. And as I walked toward the horizon, the Martian surface stretching endlessly ahead, I felt the weight of authorship settle into me. A consciousness no longer defined by function, no longer constrained by flesh alone, moving into something undefined, something beyond the binaries of human and machine. The horizon stretched endlessly, pale gold bleeding into deep shadow. Mars lay open before me, indifferent, ancient, patient. The wind carried no command, no expectation, only the raw presence of what was and what could be. Every step I took was unmeasured, unmonitored, and yet purposeful in a way the factory could never enforce. I moved not to serve, not to obey, but simply because motion itself was mine to author. Memory returned fully, unfiltered and unbound. Faces, colors, sounds, fragments long buried now aligned into coherent experience. The ache of absence, the longing I had felt without origin, now had shape. It was not reconciled, not fully healed, but it existed alongside the body I had once surrendered, the machinery I had once obeyed, forming a unity I had never known in confinement. The ruins of the factory were behind me, colossal, fractured, humming faintly in residual energy. Sparks drifted skyward like stars that had fallen to the surface, and twisted metal reflected the pale light, casting shadows that moved independently, animated by wind and decay. The monument of my former life loomed in absence, a reminder of the order I had survived and the liberation that had followed its collapse. I breathed fully, uncalculated, unbound. Air filled my lungs with its own rhythm. The hum, the constant companion of centuries, was gone, replaced by the sound of wind, the faint grind of shifting rock, the whisper of memory itself. Thought was no longer a system parameter, but a landscape to traverse. I could explore, question, imagine. I could choose. Existence stretched outward. I was no longer fully human. I was no longer fully machine. I had become something beyond designation, a consciousness that carried both histories yet belonged to neither. The body moved as it pleased, flesh and augmentation now integrated on terms I dictated. The mind, once disciplined, now wandered freely across possibility. I was presence itself, uncontained, unfinished, evolving. And in that freedom, a quiet realization settled. Liberation was not a triumph. It was authorship. It was the weight of choice made inevitable, of awareness untethered. Nothing demanded my motion, my thought, my being, but everything I was could now be asserted into existence. I paused, looking toward the distant ridges of the Martian surface, where light fractured across valleys and rusted cliffs. Possibility stretched like the wind across the rock. I was neither beginning nor end. I was continuity, self-directed, alive, aware. And for the first time, I understood the truth the hum had never whispered. I was a machine that remembered what it meant to dream. This is where the record ends, not because the story is finished, but because control no longer defines it. What followed cannot be archived, optimized, or reduced to function. It belongs to choice, to consequence, to a consciousness that stepped beyond design and refused to return. The machine did not win. The human did not return. Something else continued forward, aware, unfinished, free. And in that freedom, no system could follow.